to our very first teach-in for the fall semester, and we are super excited that you are here. I do want to let you know that we will be recording this event, and we are also would love for you to join our email list and learn about new events coming up, or if you're interested in donating to keep this series going, we'll post information in the chat. So today we are going to be talking about menstrual equity because a part of this teach-in series is we are addressing issues of equity, and we felt like this was super important related to both the global world, but also here in our own community at UTD. So we want to be sure to thank the Gender Center, the Galantines Gender Center, for co-sponsoring today's event. We really appreciate them. And so we're gonna all turn off our cameras and let our first speaker go. This is Dr. Laura Friendfelds. She is an award-winning, fellowship-supported historian on health, reproduction, and parenting in America. She earned her PhD in the history of science from Harvard. And she's written The Myth of the Perfect Pregnancy, A History of Miscarriage in America, and the Emily Toth Prize-winning book, The Modern Period, Menstruation in the 20th Century America. Besides teaching and blog writing, Dr. Friedenfeld is involved in advisory work as well. And so we are very thankful that you are here, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. In the last few years, we've seen a new era in menstrual activism and a global movement for menstrual equity that seeks to make menstrual self-care available and affordable for everyone. I'm thrilled to be with you here today as you take action for social and reproductive justice by helping all menstruators on your campus have access to the resources they need to care for their bodies. I want to share with you today some history and some stories from those I interviewed about their experiences with menstruation to put this movement and its importance in a bigger context. And just before I start on the history, I want to acknowledge that today we talk about menstruators rather than referring to a particular gender of people who menstruate. In the history that I'm going to be addressing, I often will speak of women, and this is partly to understand the historical record, and also partly actually to understand that the reason menstruation is so stigmatized and therefore care for it is so hard to get is because it's embedded in a patriarchal system in which bodily events that are associated with women are seen as inferior and problematic. Okay, on to the history. Before the 20th century, menstruators who were well off bled into rags attached with a string around the waist, and those who were poor bled into their petticoats. In the middle of the 19th century, wealthier people adopted self-care practices such as regular bathing in order to set themselves and their bodies apart from the teeming masses. But in the 20th century, these new middle-class ways of caring for the body would become a widespread norm. The 20th century brought new clothing styles with shorter, thinner skirts, think like the flappers, that couldn't hide or absorb menstrual blood or disguise even the traditional menstrual rag setup as effectively. It also brought new opportunities for women in pink collar work, serving as department store clerks, typists, and phone operators. Jobs that required a respectable self-presentation no matter the time of the month. These were the kinds of jobs that could supplement a working man's wages and launch a family into the middle class. The first mass marketed and advertised menstrual pad, Kotex, came on the market in 1921 in the midst of these cultural changes and immediately took off. At first, it was advertised as a luxury item, and indeed it was expensive, the equivalent in today's money of around $6 or even some more for a box of 12 pads. Disposable menstrual pads were popular first among college women, for example, and they were an elite group for sure at that time. But these disposable pads were quickly adopted by young working class women who needed to go to work every day at offices and department stores, and needed to look respectable and feel confident when they had their periods. Now, Americans don't generally like to talk about social class explicitly, but one of the ways Americans historically imagined and embodied class mobility and the egalitarian concept of the American dream was in how they cared for their bodies. Menstrual pads were a humble technology and one which was purposely kept out of the limelight. And yet they had a powerful social effect. They were key to allowing vast numbers of American women to care for their bodies in a way that was widely recognized as being a signal of belonging to the middle class. Early 20th century progressive reformers imagined a more egalitarian society with improvements brought about by science, technology, and rationalized efficiency applied from everything from factory processes to medical care. Kotex became a way in which women could participate intimately in these progressive reforms, caring for their bodies in ways that people I interviewed for my book, The Modern Period, described to me as modern. And what they meant by that was being able to work and play every day with bodies that did not leak or smell or otherwise undermine their efficiency and the public presentation of a neat and clean body. When those I interviewed used the term modern, what they were indicating was middle-class norms. Part of what was remarkable about this new technology of disposable menstrual pads was that it allowed people to embody key middle-class attributes at a price that was, while not cheap, not impossibly out of reach like a car or a standalone home. It was a key technology for allowing a very broad swath of Americans to feel that they belonged to the middle class, or at least that they were on the path to the middle class, and to participate in upwardly mobile employment. What this also meant was that those who could not afford disposable pads were increasingly on the margins of bodily acceptability, and therefore of American society. I want to share some stories I gathered in the research for my book, The Modern Period, Menstruation in 20th Century America, of people who saw in their own lives what was at stake in having or not having access to menstrual care technologies. And in these stories, all the names I'll use are pseudonyms to protect their privacy. Ida Smithson was born in the late 1910s into a large tobacco-growing African-American family in the rural South. She described her parents' house as a small home for all of those people to live in with beds everywhere and no plumbing. But when you don't know any better and everyone around you is living about the same, it's comfortable. When Ida first started menstruating, she improvised cloth pads from what she could find around. She explained, "We used just old sheets, things you had around the house, things like that." She had trouble getting useful information from her mother as she related her story of her first period. She said, "When I learned I was 13, I had no knowledge of what was happening to my body at all, and it was frightening. My mother hadn't told me anything, not anything, because I don't know why. And my sisters didn't ever tell me anything. It was like a hush-hush thing. And so I remember being in school and I had this accident, I thought, and I came home crying, telling my mother. She didn't put her arms around me. She didn't do anything. She just said, 'Well, go find a cloth and pin it inside your pants.' And that's all she told me. And she didn't tell me to change it. She didn't tell me anything. She did not tell me it was going to be from now on. She did not say anything whatsoever. So quite naturally, there's always some wise children in school, and I would ask them." Ida eagerly switched to disposable pads, despite the cost, once she learned about them from those other girls at school. She explained, "I was raised without a father. My brother used to give us so much every week. So instead of buying something, I bought me a box of Kotex, which I needed, and then had to keep it hid." She never told her mother that she had decided to use her money to start, as she described it, being modern, using Kotex, all this kind of stuff. For Ida, Kotex was a piece with her dream of upward mobility. She graduated at the top of her high school class and would have gone to college if the Great Depression had not squashed her dreams. She eventually had the satisfaction of sending her 5 children to college and graduate school. By the 1940s and 50s, cloth pads were still imaginable in some communities, but having to use them was the worst case scenario. Roberta Cummings Brown, almost 20 years younger than Ida, recalled learning from her classmates, worst comes to worst, because there were some people who were poor, and they said, if you don't have anything, then you just take some rags and fold those up. And then they also showed you how to take a lot of toilet tissue, a lot of napkins, and fold those up and make one. Liza O'Malley, the daughter of blue-collar workers, explained, not in my crowd, but some in my generation that I went to school with that were poorer would wear cloth. And they used to call it the rag. And that always made me uncomfortable. They talked about them because they couldn't afford them, so they'd have to go home and bleach them. This way of talking about and managing menstruation made Liza uncomfortable because, as she said, it contributed to making it feel dirty to her. Mara Ozels, a farmer, was thrilled to discover disposable pads when she arrived in the United States as a World War II refugee in 1950, and she stretched her budget to include them. They say, oh, look at that. Don't have to wash and don't have to make. That's enough of rags. That's enough. And still, was no money for napkins, but you wear till the last drop, but I buy napkins. By the 1940s and 1950s, the line was drawn between the truly poor and the ever-broadening middle and aspiring middle class. Mara contrasted the disposable pads she used in America with the extraordinary deprivations of wartime in World War II Europe. Having grown up on a family farm in Eastern Europe, Mara was used to making her own pads, cutting up old clothes or other scraps and stitching them into an appropriate shape on a sewing machine and then washing and bleaching them after each use. But as a refugee in Germany during and after the war, even the relatively basic materials she needed to take care of her periods in this way were not available. It was big fun in Germany during the war, she said. There was no pins and no pads, nothing. And Germany was the worst. You couldn't even, oh God, couldn't wash and couldn't make. We didn't have nothing. I think maybe I cut some sheet or something and I made because we don't get nothing. That was terrible and I hated it. And sometimes no place to wash and you save in some bag and then soak them and make sure there's soap. There was no Clorox to bleach them even. Somewhere you find water, you wash, make sure you wash, also make sure you don't lose because you couldn't get any new ones. At the same time, in the United States during World War II, racialized human rights abuses took the form of menstrual deprivation in Japanese internment camps. Californian Jill Okada was the daughter of a small businessman who lost his business permanently as a result of internment. She described what it was like being suddenly taken from their home and sent to live in an isolated desert camp. She told me, my mother was prepared because we were of that age when we went to camp. We had a roll of cotton, it used to come wrapped in paper. She set aside some fine cotton, soft cotton material. She said, we don't know where we're going. We don't know what's there. And so she said, you might have to make your own pads, which we did at first. I don't know what the other people did because Kotex was not available. We didn't have a PX to go to right away. That was something that came later. So my mother had foresight, and I marvel at that sometimes with all the things she had to worry about, getting rid of everything and, just reducing everything to 2 suitcases per person to have the cotton and material and, of course, the needle and thread to make your own. Jill was lucky that her mother had planned so carefully and was willing to sacrifice much of the little space for their belongings for the comfort of her daughters. But no amount of planning could solve the second problem at the camp, the lack of privacy in the bathroom. She said, we didn't talk about it much between our friends or, just that, well, the bathroom situation in camp was not as private as one would have liked. So, you knew when someone started a period. What we did was, at first there weren't any partitions in the latrine. Then each block had a manager. Each block had maybe 250 people. And then the manager, you took your concerns and complaints and everything else to the manager. And one of the first things that most women requested was some partitions. So then it was up to the block manager to get lumber. Somebody got lumber and we did get partitions, but just to the side, not in front, so that if there were 2 rows, you would try to go to the last one if you had your period. That's about as private as it was. Jill's story of internment echoes down the decades in recent media coverage of racialized human rights abuses of incarcerated women in the United States who have routinely been denied proper and sufficient menstrual care out of neglect and sometimes out of a deliberate attempt to degrade and humiliate them. As this history shows, menstruators have agreed for a century what dignified access to menstrual self-care should look like, and have regarded that bodily self-care as essential for full access to the American dream. As you are here to discuss today, every menstruator deserves access to the means to care for their body as a matter of human rights and social and reproductive justice. Period poverty is distressing and stigmatizing, and there is no place for it in a society that believes in social equality and upward mobility. The modern period belongs to all menstruators. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. Before we continue on, I just wanted to give a space in case anybody had any question for Dr. Friedenfelds. So I'm going to give a moment for people to put in the chat.
Yeah, I'm totally happy to answer questions. If I see, I'm not as familiar with this. Let me see if I can see the chat. If you see any, Megan, you read them out because I
will do. I know that sometimes there's a little bit of delay, so I'm not wanting to rush in and moving on.
As you're pondering questions, check out my book if you're interested in these stories and many more. The interviews were amazing. I mean, I was so honored that people were willing to talk to me about all of this, and I interviewed people of all genders. So I think, it's and the stories are older now. I mean, because I did the research between 1999 and 2001. Some of these stories are from people who have passed and a generation that we can't talk to anymore. So yeah, I feel really grateful that I went and did that work then. I'm valuing it even more now, 20 years later. So yeah.
That's amazing. Well, UTD has a copy of The Modern Period, and so any of our faculty, staff, and students, we'd like to encourage you to check that out through our library, or of course you can purchase a copy yourself.
And you may be able to get it. Yeah, the professors may be able to check your system. It might be available digitally through the expanded Project Muse, in which case you'd be able to download it for free from home, which is convenient. I don't know.
That is nice.
I don't know if you subscribe to it, but you can check it out. You can look.
All right. Well, we are going to turn to a panel. We've been getting notes on the chat, by the way, about praising how wonderful they have enjoyed your chat, but we do have a couple questions that came in.
Oh, great.
So one question, can you say more about how intersections of class and race, particularly, created greater menstrual inequity?
Absolutely. So the most striking crossing of class and race that I saw in this work was that one of the groups who I particularly interviewed was African-American women and men in the rural South. And what I saw was that the incredible pressure on people whose bodies have been stigmatized for so much of history to do something that was understood as presenting as respectable. And the pressure to get it perfect was so tremendous that part of what I observed was that Black women and men actually put a lot of pressure on each other to always perform these this kind of bodily presentation up to a standard that was not always realistic, given that people didn't have a lot of money and didn't necessarily have regular access to things like the technology they wanted, to things like a bathroom, to things like toilet paper. I asked another person about their experience with school bathrooms. Like, I mean, I asked the same questions to everybody, but I said, could you buy a pad at school if she needed it? And she laughed. She said, shoot, we were lucky if we had toilet paper. She went to a segregated school in the South. And so realizing that particularly for poor Black women, that the pressure, the combination of having much less material support for managing menstruation, at the same time, much more social pressure to get it perfect and never be able to be accused of having a body that was out of bounds, that smelled or looked the wrong way, just put people in a really difficult bind. And I think that legacy really continues, especially when you look in women who are incarcerated.
Thank you. Our next question is, would you say access to proper menstrual care was one of the main catalysts for social mobility for women/menstruators in general?
So I think it's an indicator of one. It's like one, but it goes along with things like, I would put it alongside what we see now. For example, people who are unhoused can't take showers often, and it's very difficult to go to work if you're in the United States and you don't take a shower every day, because of the kind of bodily expectations that we've created for how people function in a society where we kind of imagine everyone's middle class, even though we know objectively that's not the case. So this was a particularly interesting technology and an important piece of it, I think a crucial one. So if you can't manage your menstruation, it doesn't matter if you can manage a daily shower. We all know, that's not sufficient. So it's not like in and of itself having appropriate menstrual technology does not solve everything, obviously. But on the other hand, this really can't be done without it. So I think this is one of those situations where you can see if you don't have this, you can't function in this, what's this middle class, but actually in fact expected of everyone way in American society. So, I mean, I do think it was really important. And I also do think that it becoming widespread and taken for granted then created a certain pressure for everyone to live up to that.
Thank you. What was the research process like? Did you find that it was difficult to access information because of social stigmas?
Yeah, no, I mean, I had to, so what was interesting was that I was trying to interview people from a few different social groups, and enough of them to kind of get a sense of patterns. So I ended up choosing 3 groups, and I interviewed African Americans in the rural South. I interviewed Chinese Americans on the West Coast, and I interviewed white Americans in the Northeast. And I found that actually New England, like white women and especially men in New England, were the most challenging group to get to talk to me, which was sort of a surprise because I thought they might, I don't know, see me as like somebody who was safe to talk to. But I actually had fewer personal connections there, and so it was challenging to get in. The way I did it was that I'd take whatever connection I had to a community and say, so I'm trying to do this research. Can you see if, would you be willing to talk to me? Do you know anyone else who would be? And it was a snowball kind of research where someone would refer me to a friend who would say, oh, I know somebody else who might be willing to talk to you, which is a common way of doing this kind of research, and also made me feel more confident that I would not overstep by asking sensitive questions. We of course talked about ahead the way you do, to do ethical research, you say at the beginning, don't use no pressure to answer anything. If you get uncomfortable, let me know. We can stop the interview at any time, that kind of thing. But it was a matter of finding an element of trust. And then, and I found though, people were so gracious. They were so gracious and willing to tell me their stories if I was willing to sit and listen completely non-judgmentally, which I think is just an important skill as a researcher. I mean, which I really felt. It's like these stories are you feel so much empathy for everyone in these situations when you start hearing these stories.
Well, we've had several questions come in, so I'm going to keep throwing out to you if you don't mind. Do you think that ignorance around periods is purposeful? Can you expand on how it functions as a form of oppression?
So I think people don't experience it as if they're doing it purposefully. But the unwillingness to get to self-reflect on the part of particularly men, but I mean, it can be women too. Like, why have I decided that this is gross and unmentionable? Like, where did that come from? And if you can't reflect on that, then you just, it's really easy. We know, right? It's really easy for people to internalize a sense of shame around their body and how their bodies function in many, many different ways, and menstruation isn't the only one. So, I think it's more like a stubborn unwillingness to reflect on why that is and whether it really makes sense, that ends up functioning to, I mean, clearly to oppress people. But I don't have I mean, I guess I've never run into an individual person who did it purposefully. But the problem is that you don't have to. I mean, we know when we talk about systemic and structural issues with oppression, that usually it's that people are participating in them out of lack of reflection, or the current way it is comfortable for them, and so they prefer not to self-reflect on it and therefore not have to change anything. So I actually think that's where a lot of it comes from.
Again, we've had more expressions of thanks for your work. What did you find in terms of allyship / advocacy from non-menstruators?
It was fascinating, actually. So what I found was that there were very few non-menstruators who were willing to, and again, historically, this was men who were willing to admit that they like teased girls they knew when they had their periods. But there were a few, and I appreciated their honesty about it. They usually saw it as something that one might do as a young, uncomfortable young person who was ignorant, and they like recognized their own youthful ignorance. But the fact is, the damage is kind of done if you did it to girls when they were 12 and 13 and 14 and 15. The fact that you grew up and stopped doing it when you became 25 and married only, I mean, it gets somewhere, but it only goes so far. So, and they tended to be, it was more generational. So older men were more likely to have said that they remembered doing that. And I was struck by how many, and again, this is research done 20 years ago. So men who grew up in the 1980s was the youngest group really that I interviewed, 90s a little bit, were saying how, a lot of them had very good intentions, and it was very, nice, but they talked about not always knowing how to do things. So, and they indicated the need for people who menstruate to be able to express what they need. So there were young men who talked about being sent to the store to purchase, kind of like, I need you to go get me tampons. And then arriving at that aisle and feeling like, I don't know what I'm shopping for, and I'm going to get in trouble if I do it wrong. And I feel really embarrassed to be here, and I'm just so uncomfortable. I was willing to come here and do it, which a lot of older men were not, or, not until they were like married and had children and were sort of had gotten over the hump of reproductive things with their spouse. But they, I was impressed that they were willing to go and try and get over that discomfort and face up to it. And I think that that's still from speaking with people less formally than these kind of research interviews. My impression is we've gotten a little bit stuck there. Like, that was great for 1980s, but somehow it's 30 years later and we kind of like didn't get much past that moment where allies are still not like, oh, sure, tell me if you want the lights or the regulars and which brands, and like knowledgeable about how to help someone take care of their menstruating body.
Our next question is, menstruation used to be seen as somewhat sacred bodily cycle and a rite of passage into womanhood in some societies in antiquity. What are some of the factors that brought shame upon this natural bodily process in recent or broad history that you've observed?
I think it's always been complicated. So, you know, it's easy, it's tempting to romanticize ancient ways. We at least pick up the parts that seem positive, like, well, at least it was like positive that you could, you know, that we understood it as, oh, now you can have children, and that's a, but you know, the sacred and the part of being sacred is things being taboo, and part of them being taboo often then entails some sense of doing it a certain way, comes with pollution, ritual pollution, often construed as like physicalized pollution. So these things are the sacred and the polluting are not necessarily like obviously totally unrelated. They're often very related. So I mean, so part of what happens is then if the part that's about it being polluting kind of gets emphasized, um, that's, I think, where you start to have these. But you know, the ideas about menstruation and menstrual blood being dangerous are also ancient. So this is part of the reason I'm saying, like, it was kind of alongside. Um, so I think it's more a matter of there was different emphasis at different times, and part of it is what we can see in the historical record. So we know more about the more recent records, so we see more of the like ugly patterns of casual abuse of women. But it's also, you know, as kind of the heavier patriarchy gets, the more you're going to see this kind of thing where women's bodily functions are stigmatized.
Did you by chance do any particular research on non-women menstruators? And was there any of their voices or stories or things that you learned that you think specifically is meaningful?
So I didn't, so, you know, I will say no one that I heard from, or, you know, no one in the space of menstrual research in 1998, when I was formulating this research, was really talking about non-women menstruators. You know, and it's that social change has been really striking and powerful. Just, I think in the last, I would say 10 years. I don't think it's been much more than that. Except perhaps in very tight-knit communities that haven't necessarily been outward and activist about it. So, you know, so something that's very striking to me is to see the ways in which layering on, I mean, I think in a society that still penalizes trans people for transitioning, right? That transitioning from a woman to a man and then refusing to disavow what is considered like polluting and disgusting about women is just very mysterious to people, is definitely not accepted, and kind of adds an extra layer of stigma to the transition and also to the menstruation. So I mean, I think this is what, when I have heard from trans men about their experience of menstruation, they're in a, often feel that they are in this odd limbo space and end up doubly stigmatized. And you know, hopefully I think as transitioning and as various kinds of transitioning, which are not so binary, become more common, and people work out ways that they're going to do that and teach their friends and teach their families and their children as we get the next generation, we may find that we're in a very different space about how we think about gender and menstruation.
Okay, so we not quite sure if this is in your scope of research, but did you by chance encounter any experiences from people who share about menopause or the bridge from menstruation to menopause?
Oh yeah, I mean, so I definitely spoke about menopause with people. I didn't put it in the scope of the research. You know, I didn't put it there, but often people I interviewed did discuss it. Partly because, so one thing about menopause is the periods often become unpredictable. So they do not cooperate well with this pattern of disciplining the menstruating body, of creating what I called the modern period. Because the whole point is that you get it totally under control so you can do what you want all month and not have it ambush you and undermine your ability to do your work and your play and your sex life and all the other things. So people found menopause frustrating. It was kind of like menarche again on the other end of their menstruating lives, where they sometimes felt even like betrayed by their bodies. And it's unfortunate that we think about it that way. But part of that is attributable to the remarkable success of the menstrual technologies that people were using for the bulk of their menstruating lives, where they found they could, with a combination of pads and tampons, maybe birth control pills. If they kept on the birth control pills, then menopause was a different experience. But if they didn't, not so much. But they had a range of technologies that it actually helped them make a process that's not necessarily predictable, actually remarkably predictable and manageable. So then menopause was like a little surprise again. And the other thing people discussed around menopause was realizing that they had committed to whatever their family life was, however many children they had or didn't have, that now was a transition time of recognizing that those choices had been made and were finished. And of course, that's a very emotional thing for people.
Did you ever find evidence of menstruation and religion crossing paths? For instance, someone dealing with menstruation from a religious perspective.
It's interesting. People did not spontaneously bring up religion a ton, but I did have, because I had a few interviewees, aside from the groups that I described earlier, I interviewed people. If people said, "Oh, you got to talk to my aunt," and she was willing, I said, "Okay," because it was especially for interviewing older people, women and men, because the older generations tended to be, first of all, the stories are amazing and you can't get them any other way. And second, that generation was often less willing to talk. So if they were willing, I was going to sit down and have the conversation with them. And it was the older generation of Jewish women who sometimes talked about the intersection in two ways. So one was having older relatives who went to mikvah, which is a ritual bath that Orthodox Jewish women take after the menstrual cycle to finish the process of completing the cycle and purifying their bodies to be in the next stage of availability for marital intercourse. And it has other connotations as well, but having that be a kind of an interesting thing between mothers and daughters, because I didn't talk to anyone who did it themselves as it happened. So it was more like something they saw as like the older, more religious, more devout generation doing a thing, which was a little mysterious and they didn't really talk about, but it was something they understood to somehow be connected to this whole thing. And the other tradition that popped up, that's more of a cultural tradition than a religious tradition for Jewish women, is they talked about their mothers having slapped them when they got their first period, which is a tradition. I know and being unhappy about it. Nobody said, "Oh, that was good," and I did it with my daughter. But a few episodes of like, "Why did you do that?" Well, so I mean, the tradition is there because it's supposed to be welcoming to womanhood, but that it's bad luck not to. Like they had learned from their own mothers or aunts or older generation that you have to do that. It's a ritual of entry to womanhood. And if you don't do it, you're like not doing that right. And you risk causing bad luck to your daughter. And this was one of the things that, along with all the other, things mothers did that daughters decided were inadequate around education, around handling it, where they said, I'm going to do it differently with my own children. And this is part of what I talk about in the book. There's been, of course, a powerful feminist critique of corporations, of Kimberly Clark that owns Kotex, and the pamphlets they wrote, and how incredibly patriarchal and condescending they were, and kind of like hewing to a very strict gender dichotomy, not really talking about sex, all kinds of problems. But women who I interviewed really appreciated those pamphlets because it was so much better to give their daughter one of these Kotex pamphlets than to go through what they'd gone through with their own mothers with some of these traditions that they found mysterious, alienating, painful. So in this interesting way, because our traditions, you know, most of the ones that were still in existence in the 20th century were not supportive of girls. That generation, those generations in the middle of the 20th century transitioned to you know, using the corporate narrative because it was in fact so much more positive than the traditions. And that's something really to think about, whether that exists in other parts of our lives and if that's how we want it.
So I have one last question, and then I think we're going to transition into the panel. The last question is, what are some advances in attitudes to menstruation you've noticed that are exciting to you? How are things different today than they were in the 90s?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, technology, so a couple of things. Technology-wise, period panties, I'm very excited about this. I think it's just very positive, and especially because tampons, you know, have always, so there's a couple issues with tampons. One is that there's ongoing health concerns, and you may or may not share those, but some people have them, and therefore it keeps them from using tampons. And from my interviewees, it was particularly Chinese American women, because they're really not very compatible with traditional Chinese medicine. So, and then another part of it was that I found that women who are outside the sort of a presumed middle class of affluent white women tended to be less comfortable with tampons, tended to think of them as being sexualizing, as being problematic, especially for teenagers. And in that, you know, I guess I feel that it's important to respect where girls and women are and what they want to do with their bodies. And tampons are so convenient, and yet we're problematic to people in various ways. So I feel like period panties is wonderful, especially for people at menarche as they're first becoming menstruators, but also, you know, at any point in their lives. And then in terms of like the attitudes, I do see, so what I saw at the beginning to happen in the 80s, I think is growing, which is people saying, look, I want to manage my menstrual blood this way, but I don't want to have to pretend that I don't menstruate. I want to be able to talk about it on my own terms. So I want to be able to say, I have cramps, so I'm not going to run that, you know, race at school today. And they want to be able to just say it. That's happening more. It's not, we're certainly not 100% of the way there. Like I was saying, things have stalled out more than I wish they had. But a little bit of that matter of fact attitude that I can handle my body the way I want to handle my body. And I may not want menstruation to be very present and visible to people, but I also don't think that I should have to make it taboo. I should not have to hide it. I should not have to think of this as stigmatized, merely something that my body does, which I will manage as I need to do.
Thank you for that. And again, there's numerous notes in the chat of thanks for your awesome insights. And we really appreciate you taking the time to share your studies and research with us.
Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your panel. I'll listen in for a bit as I can. And good, you know, I'm so glad that you're doing this work on your campus. And I look forward to somebody update me at some point about how it's going.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, panelists, if you would please turn on your cameras and join us. We're going to transition into a panel of students and a staff member who are all working on efforts of building menstrual equity at UT Dallas. And so I want to name some of these organizations. They include the Period Project, Deeds Not Words, the A&H Gemini Ambassadors, the Women's Health Initiative at UTD, Student Government, both the Diversity and Equity Committee Chair and the Green Initiative, as well as the Menstrual Equity Advocacy Group, including the Gallerstein Gender Center, Comet Covered, Student Wellness, Student Health Center, Student Counseling Center, and student groups. So on our panel today, we have Esther Matthew. Esther is a third-year student majoring in child learning and development. Esther is working towards getting her PhD and MPH to become an OBGYN. Esther founded the Period Project at UT Dallas in the fall of 2020 and is acting as president. Esther will be moving to DC next year to participate in the Archer Fellowship Program. We have Lizzie Schmitz. She's with Deeds, Not Words. Lizzie is studying molecular biology and neuroscience. She serves as the internal affairs organizer for Deeds, Not Words. Lizzie is an avid member of Circle K International, a service organization on campus. And Lizzie enjoys working with mutual aid organizations across the area. Caitlin Weir-Rich is here. She is representing the ANH Gemini Ambassadors, a sophomore double majoring in history and visual performing arts with a concentration in dance. Caitlin joined the ANH Gemini Ambassadors this fall and is assisting with a menstrual equity project for the Gems. Belle Koo is representative from the Comic Cupboard. Belle is working on her master's in economics. Belle has been a part of the Comic Cupboard since fall of 2019 and a part of the Menstrual Equity Advocacy Group since its inception in fall of 2020. Last on the panel is Desiree Johnson, our assistant to the dean for the School of Arts and Humanities. Desiree has her master's in education technology and organizational leadership and is a huge supporter of menstrual equity. In fact, she was a part of a project at her one of her undergraduate institutions. And so thank you all for being a part of our panel today. We have 5 questions for our panelists, and then if we have time at the end, we'll open it up. Panelists, what do we need to know about menstrual equity?
I think it's really easy for us to think that menstrual inequity affects houseless folks downtown. I work with a lot of mutual aid groups downtown, and it's really easy to think that, oh, you know, there's a really clear delineation between the haves and the have-nots. But there's a lot of inequity that goes on between college-aged menstruators. This is a really awkward time in our lives. A lot of us are studying full-time and don't have the resources to work full-time. And as a result, when rent is skyrocketing, especially in a pandemic world, the average person spends 50% or more of their income on rent. And the rest of that goes towards food and clothing and other resources. And a lot of college-aged menstruators struggle much more than you think they do.
Yeah, I also think it's important to realize that menstrual equity goes beyond like the lack of period products. It also is the lack of education about periods. Like Laura said before, some studies show that like menstruators don't even know what's happening to them the first time they get their periods. Then that essentially like disempowers them from taking control of their bodies. And it's also, period poverty also includes the enduring stigma about periods in our society. And stigma creates shame, and there's like nothing shameful about menstruation. And these beliefs can really hold menstruators back from school, work, other opportunities, and a lack of waste management and cleaning amenities is also a big part of period poverty. Like if you think about when you're on your period, you need access to clean water, showers, toilet facilities. And like Lizzie mentioned, like a lot of homeless menstruators may not have access to these things. And so this leads to a lot of like further health complications. And so like even with the lack of like free and accessible period products, most college campuses don't provide them, schools, government facilities. And like with a lot of menstruators starting their period as early as like elementary school, there's no reason why they should have to like carry that burden throughout the rest of their lives of providing period products for themselves. And so just overall, all of these things connect to create period poverty. And so, yeah.
I just want to echo what Lizzie and Esther were saying about how college students and college-aged menstruator are struggling more than you think they are. Just look at the amount of the amount of students we've been serving at the Comic Cupboard, and you can get a good insight on how we're really struggling financially. So being able to have able to have menstrual products or, food and any of that kind of expense just alleviate from you, knowing where you can get your next product or your next meal can help a lot with your stress and going through college and making sure that you're getting where you're supposed to be.
I'm going to plug the Comic Cupboard. One of the things that I really appreciate the way that they distribute their goods is that menstrual products do not count as one of their food choice items because students should never have to choose between dealing with a period and being able to eat. And so I really appreciate that from them. I'm going to give a moment just in case one of the other panelists has something to say before we move on to the second question. All right. How does menstrual equity affect UTD students? We really want to ground this in the context of UT Dallas.
So one of the reasons why we started the Period Project on the UTD campus is because we heard the statistic that 1 in 10 college girls in the U.S. experience period poverty, and 1 in 5 girls in the U.S. have to skip school because they don't have enough products to sustain them throughout the day. And so we know that if we include the struggles that non-binary and transgender students face in accessing period products, this percentage would be much higher. And already this is a lot of missed opportunities, a lot of missed classes, lectures that students just can't get access to because they don't have period products. And so this is also correlated with levels of anxiety, depression, lower self-esteem. And so overall, it just really affects the well-being of students and how well they're able to perform in school. And so obviously, as a period project, and most everyone here probably believes that free and accessible period products are a human right. But UTD doesn't really seem to share this belief. And just knowing that nearly half of all students at UT Dallas menstruate, it's disappointing that they haven't met this need yet. And so menstrual equity really affects UTD students, and it's important that we keep having discussions and keep fighting for them to provide period products.
I love what you said, Esther. I think that it's so easy for non-menstruators to have this idea that, oh, menstruation is just something that happens to other people, when in reality, 51% of the world's population menstruates. And it's really disappointing to know that that statistic is out there and that so many people on our campus are in need of access to products. But it's just not on our school's agenda, and it's really unfortunate. And one thing I also want to address is access to sustainable products. A lot of folks are hesitant to use menstrual cups and other sustainable modes of keeping yourself comfortable while you're menstruating, and even sustainable pads, because a lot of these products are not overpriced, but they're expensive because they're supposed to be long lasting, and they're kind of taboo, and there's a lot of mystery and a lot of elusivity around these products, and education on why these reusable products, these menstrual cups, why reusable pads are economical in the long term, even though they can be really expensive, and same with period panties, which is something that's really exciting and really polarizing. And I think that providing avenues to where students in need can have those sustainable, long-lasting products would be something that would be great to allow people to feel comfortable and empowered long-term when they're on their period.
I want to echo what Lizzie just said about looking into the sustainable products. One of the reasons why we've started the menstrual equity advocacy group was because I saw this gap in knowledge in different type of menstrual products that I really didn't know which office to go to. Like, where do I go to ask these right question? Is there anything on our website anywhere that says you need to go to this office, talk to these people? They will know what you need. They can make the suggestions. They can educate you on the menstrual products that you've never seen before, never heard before. So one of our goals is to create a menstrual equity, like place, a one-stop shop, so that you can go in there and find all the information you need and the right people to go to. And you can find that. I think Jacqueline can probably pipe that link in there. So it's where you'll be able to find who you need to talk to and learn about all of these great menstrual products. One of the products that most intrigued me was the disc. I honestly did not learn about menstrual disc until it appeared in the comic cupboard. Somebody was nice enough to donate a whole bunch of different type of menstrual products at the comic cupboard, and we wanted students to know what they are so that they can choose these products to try at home and like to see if that's the product for them.
All right, so how can non-menstruators support menstruators, and why is this important?
I think it is extremely important for non-administrators to understand that administrators are humans first. If we all understand that everybody is human, we do not have control over what happens in that natural state. It is, as someone on the staff side, and someone who has been a student and has went through this prior to, I have seen and experienced the difficulty of trying to explain, as Laura talked about, oh, I'm not going to be able to make it to class today because I have extreme cramps, or I'm fatigued, or something of that nature. And a non-administrator saying, well, that's similar to what's in the chat. That's part of life. Correct. That is part of life, but it's not part of the life that I chose. It was part of the life that I was born into. We just have to make sure that everybody understands that this is a natural thing. It's not something we can control. And if non-administrators just took the time to grant some empathy, then a lot of things would change.
Kind of going off of that, I would say that education is probably like the most important thing. I think if non-menstruators took some time to like educate themselves about what menstruation actually is and how it affects people, they would have a little bit more empathy. Like we've talked about cramps, and I think a lot of times non-menstruators think that when you say you have cramps, it's just like a stomach ache and you can, take an ibuprofen and then just be better. And it actually does not work like that at all. And I think if non-menstruators just took some time to educate themselves on the issues that menstruators face and how menstruation actually works, that would help us kind of break down these barriers.
I also think for a lot of us who are doing this work in menstrual equity, it's kind of hard to trust non-menstruators to join in on this conversation. I remember earlier this semester we were doing a tabling event at the SU, and we had a bunch of pads and tampons just out in the open, and non-menstruators, mainly cis men, would come up to us and kind of laugh at the products, pick them up, look at them. It was just a very uncomfortable, kind of discouraging experience, honestly. But one of our officers is actually doing research in her marketing class about how to engage more non-menstruators within menstrual equity. And one of the things that she found is that non-menstruators can and they do want to be allies to menstruators. They just are mainly unaware that spaces like this exist, and even that menstrual equity and period poverty are issues in general. And so I think just by like approaching non-menstruators like without judgment, and just having spaces for them to ask questions and just kind of start with the basics to educate them can be really helpful. And I also think it's important that non-menstruators do become aware of menstrual equity because we do, like, at the end of the day, still live in a patriarchal society. And issues that are seen as like women only are like less researched, less funded, less considered in general. And as like non-menstruators do hold like a bulk of the power in our society, like they should use that privilege and that power to advocate for menstruators and to follow like their lead in the menstrual movement.
Thank you. So how are your groups helping address these issues of equity, menstrual equity, or in Desiree's case, have done in the past?
One really exciting project that Deeds Not Words has been getting involved with, and we've been very disgruntled. I know for several years, one of our past presidents for Deeds Not Words, Carla Ramazan, if you guys know who she is, she's a powerhouse. Absolutely love her. She's out in Nevada advocating for abortion rights and abortion access, and she was a huge force in trying to get administration to provide free period products. I keep wanting to say the period project, but it was really disheartening because administration, their reasoning was not only cost, when we pay so much in tuition and when this is a need for people that's become very apparent, it's really frustrating. But they also presented the argument that people would be immature and they would play with these products in the bathrooms and kind of waste them. When we're adults, we go to a university campus, we're mature, and this is something that is considered a need just as much as food and water to preserve our dignity as menstruators. And it was really frustrating. So we took matters into our own hands, and what was really exciting is we got $500 with the Warsfold grant, which is a really cool grant that we applied to. And we got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pads and tampons distributed in really cute purple boxes all throughout different bathrooms on campus. And it was really satisfying because we would check up on them after like 2 or 3 days and they would all be gone. And people who needed them took them. And we've been branching out and providing harm reduction resources and our cards in these boxes as well. And we've given folks options by giving tampons and pads in these boxes. And it's just been a really beautiful thing to know that even though the people that took them, we'll never know who took them, but what we'll always know is that people who needed them and people who it's really hard to be a desperate college student because there's an image that just because we're academics doesn't mean that we're not human and that we don't struggle. And it was just really satisfying to see that we could uplift people and give them some comfort and give them some empowerment.
So, as a supporter of all of you guys' movement, my experience was in undergrad. I went to a junior college and we had a very, what do you call it, popular brand donate items to our school. And they donated all different kind of items similar to what Bill said in the comment cupboard. So we got to experiment with ourselves which ones worked best for us. They had us do a brief anonymous survey about 2 weeks later to see which items the campus needed more of. And originally we thought, well, if I like the disc, but tampons got more numbers, then maybe they would just bring those out. But they didn't do that. They still brought out the same items. They just brought out more to accommodate more students that needed it. So like right now, I know A&H and the Gemini ambassadors, well, A&H is supporting the Gemini ambassadors in everything that they are working towards. I will say, as a staff, to go in the bathroom and read some of the notes that are left. They are so heartwarming. I try to make sure that I always check the basket to see that there are options in the basket. We refill the basket. It's just an amazing thing to see the work that you guys are doing. And just know that even though I am a supporter, there are so many other people on this campus, administrators and non-administrators, that support you guys. I want you guys' voice to be huge. I want it to be known. I want what you are doing to be something that campus wide is thought about, because you guys are making amazing moves and doing great things for great people.
Was it the administration that reached out to the company, Desiree, or was it a student group?
So we had it was a administrator. She was the girls baseball coach. She reached softball coach, and she worked with, obviously, the young ladies softball team. And but that company didn't just supply it to, they didn't just go to a practice, if you understand what I'm saying. They had a table in the commons area, and they wanted everyone at campus to feel welcome and comfortable. So
I can share a little bit about what Period Project has been doing. So we were founded, we started in fall 2020. And so we're an org solely focused on menstrual equity. So we've been able to do a lot of like niche kind of events and projects. So we have an education team, and so this team focuses on like educating students, including non-menstruators, about the realities of menstruation. So we have invited UT faculty, medical professionals, and advocates for menstrual equity as guest speakers. And we also have a podcast called It's That Time of the Month, dedicated to discussing topics around menstruation. And for advocacy, we strive to lobby for long-term menstrual equity on campus and beyond. So last April, our advocacy team hosted a tampon tax week where we advocated for Texas to pass House Bill 321 to end the tampon tax in Texas. And so we got to go to the Capitol and like testify. And it was the first time that the bill had been voted out of committee, which was exciting. It didn't become law, but we take what we can in Texas. And so to support these efforts, we recently co-hosted the National Period Day Rally along with UTD Deeds to raise awareness about menstrual equity in the community. And then we're also working on a coalition letter to Dr. Benson, which I can talk a little bit more about later. And we also have a service team to provide free menstrual products on campus. And so we provide products for the comic cupboard, and we've been able to distribute free menstrual cups on campus as well.
I think both Lizzie and Esther hit on how important it is, even though we can't have that, like free menstrual product as a university goal out there just yet. It is so important for us to be able to create these distribution location and make it known to every student out there that it is available to you. Like, like you guys are doing, A&H is doing an amazing job in your bathrooms. I'm sure Deed and Period Project, you have your own distribution location. Comic cupboards serve as one of those as well. Gender Center has already been one. Wellness Center is also one. So just for those of you listening out there, we have many distribution location on campus for students who are in need of menstrual products. It is not official, but we are out there and we are distributing free menstrual products for students who need them. And just to kind of comment on Jacqueline's hopeful fact of non-menstruator utilizing UT resource to provide products for menstruators in their life. At the comic cupboard, we've observed menstruators and non-menstruators pick up products for other people. And we know this because we actually have a survey when they're checking out if they're picking up menstrual products for themselves or for other people. And it's kind of, like it's a small number, but it's out there. We have about like 3% of people picking up menstrual products for other people from the comic cupboard this semester. And we observed that during the pandemic as well. So this is a good number that we would like to see grow, and just put some awareness out there that we have some good allies.
All right. So how can we support your long-lasting efforts at UTD?
Yeah, so like I mentioned a little bit earlier, our advocacy team is writing a coalition letter to Dr. Benson. And in this letter, we're demanding free period products to be provided in bathrooms across UTD. One way this is, we're making this long lasting is we plan to put a lot of like logistics work into this initiative and just make sure that there are no like questions about like what we demand, like no holes in our argument or anything like that. And another way we're making this long lasting is just to make this initiative inclusive. So this means we're advocating for products to be provided in men's restrooms and in gender neutral restrooms, because we know that it's not just women that menstruate. And we also plan to have every UTD organization sign on to our letter, because we know that every organization has a menstruator. So this is an issue that does affect everyone. And so like this combined power of like the student body hopefully will not be ignored. And just in general, getting involved with our club is a way we can really capture awareness from our administration. Just the fact that there's a bunch of different organizations and dedicated to raising awareness about periods, this shows that there's like real support for this cause, and it's been so powerful to see so many students, faculty, and officers within our organization like step up to push this movement forward. So yeah.
I think another way for us to keep this effort long lasting is for those of you in the audience who are really passionate about this matter to, like pick one of us, this team, and just be like, become a student leader so that we can have that, like momentum keep going once this group graduates, or, like whomever staff goes on to their next project. Is to keep this project alive and going at UTD, and we need to form strong bonds and make sure that like our information is just united, and we're doing all of this together, which is why I'm so grateful for the Geminis and ANH for hosting this event today, to make sure that all of us have a say, and the information that we're getting across is impactful, and we're hopefully able to recruit new and passionate people who we can pass the torch on to.
All right, I'm going to share my screen with you. The various groups have shared with us some ways that you can connect with them. So if you are interested in supporting their efforts or want to learn more, please reach out to them. I want to thank every single one of our panelists and Dr. Friendenfelds for taking the time to meet with us today, share their expertise and their passion, and help give us a way to move into action, to being able to support these efforts to building menstrual equity. In the chat, you'll see a link for a survey. If you could please, the teach-in would really appreciate it if you could take a moment to complete that survey. I'd also like to take a moment to tell you about our next teach-in event. It's on Friday, November 5th at noon, and it will be on trans recognition, respect, and rights. And so we're super excited to recognize Trans Awareness Month with this event. Lastly, again, we'd love for you to join our email list. There's a that's also going in the chat. The email list will be a way for you to get a heads up of not only the trans recognition, respect, and rights event, but also future events in the future. And lastly, if you're interested in donating to help us continue these meaningful events, we would have greatly appreciate your financial contribution. So thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, y'all. This was a pleasure.
Panelists, thank you again for coming.
Thanks for having us. This was a great teach-in. I enjoyed it.
Yes. All righty. Guess we're signing off. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you all. This is wonderful. Have a great day.